Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is donor supported. We are supported by gifts that you give us, that we're able to do all of the things that we do here, and that includes exploring topics like the one we're discussing today. It's precisely because I am able to do this now as a job that I have the time to read 6 books in preparation for a podcast, which is what I did today, which was not something that I could possibly do while being engaged in other ministry full time. So if you want to see more of this kind of content and more publications and more of what we do, we really do appreciate your support. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page there. You could sign up on Patreon. If you give an amount of either $6 or more a month, you also have access to our Discord server. And I will be posting a link to this on the Discord server days before it actually comes out publicly on YouTube. And I do that pretty regularly for podcasts and videos. So you can get some access to YouTube videos prior to when they actually come out if you are part of the Discord. So today on the program, as I mentioned, I read a bunch of books in preparation for this. I'm talking about something kind of weird, I guess, a little strange compared to what I usually talk about, and that is near-death experiences. And it's something that I've thought about for a long time, honestly. I've had some interest in this area for quite a long time. And the reason I haven't really delved into it before is because I've always kind of had questions of what the value of these kinds of experiences are. Is there any value to them? When we're speaking about things that are purely subjective, does it really have any apologetic value at all? Can it be verified in any sense whatsoever? Are we just engaging when we talk about these kind of things in kind of new age spirituality kind of stuff that often goes along with near-death experiences? Is this something that's just crazy, like talking about UFOs or Bigfoot? Is there any value to this? Those are the kind of questions that I've often had with near-death experiences. So let me just give you a little bit of a background of my interest in particularly the question of the soul, and the question of the soul in terms of apologetics and its apologetic value. One of the things that I've been prepping for a number of years is a volume that I'm going to write at some point in my life, which is part of my Contemporary Protestant Scholastic Theology series, but a volume on dualism, substance dualism. So, they're maybe not substance dualism. There are different forms of dualism, and that will be one of the topics of the book as well. Not in the Cartesian sense, which I have some issues with the way Descartes frames it, but nonetheless, the idea that humans are created with a dual nature, meaning that we are composed of both body and soul, and that an immaterial soul actually exists and is fundamental to who we are, and in some ways even more fundamental to who we are than the body is. And this is for this anthropology volume. As I said, I really want to delve into some of the questions about materialism and how a materialistic explanation works for the nature of the human self, the nature of the human person, and how I think it ultimately falls short. So when Christian theologians grab onto notions of a Christian version of a materialism, this idea, because of the Christian conviction of the materiality of the resurrection, there are some Christians that have tried to grab onto this materialism when it comes to the human person, to argue that, well, the term for nephesh, soul, really just means person in the Old Testament, and that's we've imported this Greek idea of soul into the Hebraic concept, which isn't of an immaterial soul. That's part of this argument. Now, part of if you've paid attention to my work, and specifically the series that this is going to be involved in, what I'm trying to do is in some ways vindicate the use of Greek philosophy and theology to a certain extent, in that I think a lot of the models that have been proposed by theologians, especially in the last 100 years, but it goes even beyond that, at least into the 19th century. But a lot of the models that have been proposed that set Hebraism, or the kind of Jewish approach to theology and ideas in general, that set the Hebraic approach against a Hellenistic or a Greek approach that has often been used to dismiss a lot of ideas like things like the immortality of the soul, that move in theology has really been a mistaken one, and that when we look at what the New Testament does, the New Testament really does grab onto a lot of elements of what developed in the Greek world. Not all of them. There are plenty of things to criticize in Greek philosophy. I don't believe that, the writings of Plato are divinely inspired, but I do think that when we look at someone like Plato, he really did understand a lot of parts of the nature of reality, and we have to admit where Plato got things right, and we have to say that through general revelation, God has revealed certain things in nature, in creation, that people like Plato were able to grab onto, and through that, they were able to understand a large part of what things are actually true, how the world actually works. And part of that is the immateriality of the soul. So, in light of that, that basic background and my interest in this question, I focused a lot of my thinking in terms of the philosophical arguments. I've read quite a bit philosophically on arguments for the existence of the soul and arguments against the existence of the soul for materialists. And I did a podcast on this a number of years ago now, and I think nobody listened to it. I mean, it was like my least listened to podcast ever. I am so interested in the topic, but it seemed like no one else really cared very much. So I don't know. Maybe I can do something again if now, having grown in terms of my audience via YouTube quite a bit since that time, maybe there'd be more interest. Let me know if there is. But it's something that I'm very interested in, is philosophical arguments for the existence of the soul. So as I, delved into some of those philosophical arguments, which I think are airtight, by the way, I think that, just demonstrably, if I was not a Christian, and obviously I am, but if I did not believe that Scripture was the written revelation of God, just by the use of reason and the use of philosophy, I would not be a materialist. I think the philosophical arguments are airtight, that the self is not composed of just material things, unless you are going to just deny the existence of the self altogether, which is ultimately what materialism leads to, which is complete and utter nonsense. So just in terms of rationality, philosophical argumentation, I think materialism doesn't hold water. There are different ways of approaching the existence of the soul when you look at the philosophy of mind and the immateriality of the mind, distinction between mind and brain. There are all sorts of different proposals that exist today. Not all of them are necessarily Christian ones. You have things like panpsychism, which says consciousness is something that's just kind of part of all of reality. You have all sorts of different views, and maybe we could spend some time on that if people want me to delve further into that topic. But I think, again, reason, just purely by reason, I think it is demonstrable just by philosophical argumentation. If philosophical argumentation can prove anything at all, then I believe that it can indeed demonstrate that the mind is not material. So that's true as far as just philosophy goes. And that's where I've really focused a lot of my time in terms of proofs of the soul. So we have, the exegetical component, we have the theological challenge, which is, what does Scripture teach? Does Scripture teach that the soul is really immaterial and separable from the body? Or does the Bible teach that we are essential, because our physical nature is so essential to who we are, that, for example, there is no intermediate state, that between my life now and the resurrection on the final day, there is no intermediate state of a bodiless existence. That's the argument that some will make. Sometimes this idea is called soul sleep, that our soul is essentially asleep because it can't function without the body. That's how it's made to function within our bodies. So we basically are just non-conscious between my death now and then the day of judgment, the resurrection of the dead. And so I have then the exegetical arguments where I would absolutely say that the soul is immaterial. I think that it is something that is demonstrable from especially the New Testament. I think there are indications in the Old Testament as well, but it's not that clear. But specifically when you're dealing with the New Testament and in a context in which the immaterial soul is largely taken for granted by many within the first century, Roman context, when Jesus speaks about, one who can kill both body and soul, he's distinguishing between body and soul. And I think that's also demonstrable from things like what Paul says when he says to depart, to be with Christ immediately. This day you will be with me in paradise. The thief on the cross is told while he has a physical body there. I know that there are questions of things like the timelessness of the new heavens and new earth. So maybe, they're kind of transported immediately to the last day. So it kind of is today. And there are all these kinds of questions. But we have the exegetical claims, which I argue are strongly against this idea of materialism. And essentially, I think that it's something that is really a capitulation to bad philosophy. It's Christians trying to demonstrate that they're okay with philosophical developments in support of materialism in some ways, when in reality, actually, the philosophy points far in the other direction. So then there's the exegetical claims, and then there's the philosophical claims, which I think are extremely weak when you deal with eliminative materialism. If you look at a Daniel Dennett or a Paul and Patricia Churchland, I think it's extremely weak and simply against our sense experience. It's simply opposed to our common sense. So I think when we're dealing with questions of the soul, the existence of the immaterial self should be a given, because it is only through the notion of the existence of the self that we can even use the scientific method at all. And it's through the scientific method that we come to know what the material world is, or that it exists, or how it functions. None of that would be possible without our internal conscious experience, i.e. ourselves. That is something immaterial. But so there is all of that background. But now we get into the question that I want to delve into today. And I know it's a lot of background there, but hopefully it's not totally useless. So, because I want to set some context as to why do I think this is even important? Or is it important, and what context I'm talking about this in? Because I want to make it clear that I'm not approaching this from I like weird supernatural phenomenon. This is wild, so I want to talk about it. But then the other part of the argumentation is, well, what can we say from experience? Is there any kind of testable reality? Is there any kind of testable experience wherein the human soul is actually distinct from the body in ordinary human life? Is there something we can do to verify this, scientifically in some way? I mean, scientifically is kind of a broad term, and I don't know how well the phrase, scientifically even fits into a question like this, but as scientifically as is possible. Is there some kind of testable, observable phenomena that we can look at to say, along with the philosophical and exegetical points, that the soul is separable from the body, and we have some evidence for this? So, all of that being said, the place where we really see this, something that is testable and has been studied quite a bit, is in the nature of near-death experiences. Now, near-death experiences, what I'm speaking of there is not experiences where somebody is just near death and they have, a change of life afterwards because they realize the frailty of life or something like that, and they convert, say, to Christianity. Those things are certainly important, and there are many conversion narratives like that. That's not what I'm talking about with a near-death experience, not just someone who has come near death. But specifically, what I'm identifying here in terms of near-death experiences, or NDEs as it's shortened, is this phrase that was first used, and this phenomena is, it extends as far back as we have recorded human history, but the actual phrase was popularized by a book by a man named Raymond Moody in 1975, which is called Life After Life. This book I actually read in high school. I had someone who was kind of into New Age stuff who gave me this book, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of weird. And I read it, and I was like, oh, that's interesting, but that was kind of the end of it. but I have read the original book. So this book, Life After Life, in that work, Moody refers to a very particular set of experiences that are common as near-death experiences, or NDEs. So what's involved in that experience is not just coming near death, but having an out-of-body experience. So OOBE, as it's sometimes summarized as. So an out-of-body experience. In other words, there is a time in which many individuals who are near the point of death, who in some ways have died, not final biological death, obviously, because they come back and talk about their experiences. But there are a number of experiences where someone has no heart rate whatsoever, with serious cardiac events, and has often no brain activity. So we have people that are measurably hooked up to EKGs and EEGs, so that their heart and brain activity are being monitored. And in such a state, there is some kind of conscious experience where they are disconnected from their body. And there are all sorts of elements to these experiences. So Moody outlines this, and there are a number of things that tend to identify these experiences as he begins kind of interviewing people and talking to people who have had these experiences. There are some areas of overlap. So we have kind of the popular things that we see just in popular media, like there's a tunnel that shows up, and you pass through this tunnel into the portal of death or whatever. The tunnel experience actually is not that common, which is not that it's uncommon, but when you do look at a lot of the studies, that's like the one thing that it seems like a lot of variables change whether someone explains whether there is a tunnel or not, and that includes things like age and culture, more than most of the other elements of the experiences. For whatever the reason for that is, I don't know. And we'll talk about what's the cause of some of the differences between these experiences. So we have the tunnel experience. We have an experience of being out of the body. So individuals feel like they're out of their body. But not just a feeling of being out of the body, but specifically, it's usually a feeling of being, up at the ceiling and looking down on your body. So you can actually see yourself. You can see your body. You can see, say, the doctor's operating on you. You can see what's going on in the room around you. Another element, so we have the tunnel, which is somewhat common. We have the out-of-body aspect of the experience, which is a second major part of this phenomena. The third is there generally is an explanation of a heightening of the senses, so that one senses things in a way that is more clear and more real than reality itself. A very common part of this is they say that this feels like reality, and that when they enter back into their bodies, now that feels like a dream. So the relationship between a dream and reality, as we know it, is kind of how they experience the relationship between here and that experience. So it felt more real to them. And this is the majority of individuals. And there have been a number of studies that have asked a lot of survey questions, but the majority of individuals who have this experience express that it feels more real than regular everyday experiences from within the body. So that's part of it. We have another common phenomena, which is a sense of timelessness. Sometimes this can be like complete timelessness, that you were outside of time altogether, or sometimes the experiencers describe something that is more like just a different way of approaching time. So time feels very different. It's not passing linearly in the same way that it is in our ordinary human experiences. So that's in almost every account. Again, almost every account. So they're not all identical, and they don't all have every single element. Another is that we see that these individuals most often see some kind of figures, and those figures can be beings of light, and sometimes they can be dead relatives. Sometimes dead friends. It's almost always relatives, for whatever reason. So we see those that are dead or beings of light. Then, let's see, what is this? 6. We've got feelings of profound love and peace. We have some kind of view of the light that is often identified as God. Okay, so that's 7. 8, let's see, we have, and there are, I think, 9 of these that I had. So let me see if I can remember all of them that I had in mind. Then we have this sense of kind of connection with all people. There's some kind of connection with reality or with others specifically that we didn't sense prior to that. In the 9th, there is a clarity of thought and of understanding. So that when individuals are in this experience, they often say, I could think clearly. All of a sudden, everything made sense. I could look back on life and see why everything happened the way it did. All of a sudden, my mind was clear. So those are 9 of the elements that are very common in near-death experiences. And There are others as well, but those are kind of some of the major ones that we're going to be looking at as we think about this topic. So, with all of that background, that's what we're defining as near-death experiences. Something that includes maybe not every single one, all of those elements, but at least some of those elements are involved to make it a near-death experience in the way that we're defining it here. So we have, a few different things we have to ask with these experiences from a Christian theological perspective. One is simply, is there any evidence that these experiences are anything real? Right? Is there any evidence that this is something more than just what's going on in the brain? Because there are a number of materialistic explanations. There are a number of Susan Blackmore is probably the most well-known published author arguing for a materialistic approach to near-death experiences. I've read a number of articles from scientific journals, both popular and academic, giving arguments for a materialistic explanation. So there are a number of proposals as to how the near-death experience really is just an event going on in the brain. And it's not anything beyond that. So we're going to look at that question, which is this something that's just going on in the brain, or is there something that's actually verifiable about this? Is it a kind of subjective experience that you have when you're on an acid trip? Because if that's the case, then clearly this may tell us something interesting about our biological selves and how our brain functions, but it doesn't tell us anything about spirituality. It certainly doesn't tell us anything about the nature of the soul. Okay, so if that's the case, then it's maybe interesting scientifically, biologically, doesn't really have relevance to the field of, say, apologetics. Or philosophy, really. So that's one question we have to ask. Then we have to ask the question, well, as Christians, how does this fit with our particular Christian worldview? Are these experiences something that fit with Scripture? And we can ask this in a couple ways. One is, does Scripture allow for the separability of body and soul? To that, I'm going to answer yes. But then, what about the content of these experiences? Does the content of these experiences line up with what Scripture tells us is the nature of, say, the afterlife, the nature of existence apart from the body, the nature of the soul, the nature of God, who Jesus is, these kinds of questions. Okay, so there's that. And then we have to ask, the third part of this is, if there are elements that do not line up with scriptural revelation, can we say, and should we say, that there is a demonic element to at least some of these experiences? And then that leads us to the fourth question, which is, what did the supposed revelations that people receive in these experiences, what relevance do those actually have for the church? Should we be forming our ideas of who God is based on what someone tells us in an experience like this? Should we form our ideas of the afterlife based on what we hear from somebody? If someone says, Jesus told me XYZ is true, and that person otherwise seems reliable, and that thing is not taught in Scripture, does the church then begin to teach that that's true because we have someone that seemingly has a reliable, testable experience? Those are all questions that we need to answer when addressing this. So the first thing we're going to start with is the question of whether or not the materialistic explanations of this phenomena actually make sense. Is there evidence that this is something beyond what's going on in the brain? Now, let me tell you, before I jump into some of those things, let me just tell you some of the books that I read in preparing for this, because I did read a number of them. And I can, if you want to read further into this topic, these are some of the things that you can read. So let's see. Two of the books that I read were not from a Christian perspective at all. And this is really where I wanted to start. I have read the first, the Raymond Moody book I have read as well. So that's three that I've read. But that wasn't one that I read this last week. So the first is Evidence of the Afterlife, The Science of Near-Death Experiences by Jeffrey Long. Jeffrey Long is a big name in this field. He's written a bunch on this. Then After, a doctor explores what near-death experiences reveal about life and beyond by Bruce Grayson. By the way, all of the covers of all of these books are so ugly. I don't know what it is, but I just do not like the covers of any of these. doesn't make heaven look very attractive if that's what it looks like. Okay, then we have some Christian books that I've read. So to get a Christian perspective, the first is Near-Death Experiences as Evidence for the Existence of God and Heaven by J. Steve Miller. Jeffrey Long wrote the foreword to that. Then we have The Soul After Death by Seraphim Rose, which gives an Eastern Orthodox perspective. That's a weird book, but really interesting, actually. I think he makes some really good points. Then there is Imagine Heaven, Near-Death Experiences, God's Promises, and the Exhilarating Future That Awaits You by John Burke. And then the final book is Beyond Death, Exploring the Evidence for Immortality by Gary Habermas and J.P. Moreland. It's Habermas that wrote the sections on near-death experiences. This book goes beyond that. I haven't read the rest of the book, but I've read the sections on near-death experiences and as well as on the question of past lives and things like that, which is also a very interesting chapter in this work as well. And you will see a lot of that discussion of things like past lives and reincarnation. All of this stuff shows up in a lot of the literature, largely because it is a lot of kind of new age types that are really promoting this idea of near-death experiences and a lot of the necessity to experience these things yourselves and through all sorts of weird things. Okay. Those are all of the books that I read. Among the Christian perspectives, there were very different approaches in a lot of these texts as to how Christians should approach them. But in all of these texts, all of these Christian authors have made the argument in their books that something real is going on. There is a real spiritual phenomena that is occurring with near-death experiences. There are different ways of explaining it. And again, we'll talk about that. But something real is happening. So then is that the case? Because from a Christian approach, we could easily just say, hey, this isn't final death. There's a biological explanation. We know that there are biological explanations for all sorts of weird visions and things that people have. So maybe that's the case here. And if that's the case, it's kind of irrelevant. So we say, okay, well, it's just a weird experience and the brain is wired in a certain way and you see weird things and there you go, whatever. Then it wouldn't really have relevance to the question of life after death in any way whatsoever. So that would be a fine and valid Christian approach to this question, if indeed it can just be demonstrated scientifically that there's nothing going on besides something that's happening in the brain. So then the question is, scientifically, do we even have to reckon with this? Right? Because as Christians, if it's just biologically something that happens, then we don't have to deal with it. We say, okay, it's just a weird biological phenomena. God programmed it into us for some reason. Maybe it's a product of the inner longing that we have for heaven or for something eternal that's wired into our brain somehow. Pretty interesting, but pretty easy to then kind of explain away. So there are a number of materialistic explanations, specifically the materialistic explanations propose that, and there are a bunch of different proposals in terms of exactly what's going on in the brain. But we have things like the nature of endorphins. We have connections between near-death experiences and, say, drug experiences. DMT in particular is probably the closest, but there are other drug experiences as well that can induce things that are similar to something like near-death experiences. We can look at a phenomena like something like a New Age practice of astral projection. And I think that actually gives us some good parallels to talk about what's real and what's not with things, because when we look at things like remote viewing and astral projection, they don't have nearly the kind of evidence that something like an NDE has. But they're claimed phenomena that have kind of similar effects. We have, there's phenomena with pilots where they see kind of tunnels in some way that, speed and gravity and all of these things can cause some weird visual things to happen. We know that people have weird things happen when they have seizures, or there are all sorts of events that we experience in ordinary life that those who are arguing for a materialistic explanation of near-death experiences are going to say, look, we have other phenomena that we know is biological, and it causes many of the same effects as a near-death experience. So if that's the case, then we can say, well, a near-death experience is just these kinds of things. It's some kind of combination of these very natural events that we know are natural events. And we can demonstrate this in other ways, even if we don't know exactly what's happening in the brain at the time of the near-death experience, because it certainly is the case that our ideas of the brain, while they're improving immensely in many ways, we don't have a great understanding of exactly how the brain functions. There's much that we don't know. So just because we can't currently explain exactly what the process in the brain is that's causing this, then that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be biologically explained. It just means like we don't have right now the knowledge to know exactly what chemicals are doing what in the brain or what's firing where. But we can say we know it's naturalistic because we have these other parallels and these other kind of events. Okay, so that's basically going to be the argumentation behind materialistic explanations. So what is the challenge then to materialistic explanations? And Susan Blackmore, she's got the most kind of robust argument for this, and she's going to make an argument that this is something that is very specific that's going on. Whatever this event is, it's something very specific that occurs near death. So she's going to accept more of a differentiation between this event of the near-death experience and then just some of these parallels. So some people are really going to draw these parallels out, I think, far beyond where they should, where Blackmore is going to acknowledge the uniqueness of the experience in a way that some of the others will not. So she sees it as a unique experience, that something that the body does when it's near the point of death. Okay, so are there reasons then to say that those explanations don't really work? And I think here we have to do more than just say, well, none of this can be explained yet, because none of the parallels that they really have, given us are that strong. It can't really be explained yet, so it must not be a material process. That doesn't really work. We have to go beyond that. Is there something that really demonstrates not just that they haven't figured out what causes it yet and may in the future, but we have to demonstrate, is there some reason to show that it indeed seems like it's impossible for this to be a material process? Now, we can start first with just the parallels. And I think this is something that you see very clearly when you start reading some of the literature, especially in like popular scientific publications, like Scientific American, something like that. Some of these articles are so obviously dismissive, and it became really clear reading some of these articles that the people writing these articles have no idea about the literature that's been published on the subject, like none. And like I've researched this for a week, and I read a bunch of books and articles, but like that, when I did that, now I can read any of these very like popular articles and say these people don't know what they're talking about, and like it doesn't take that much research. So they come from materialistic assumptions, and then just grab onto, oh, well, there's a phenomena here in an acid trip that looks kind of like something I heard about in a near-death experience. So, that must be similar things going on in the brain. There you go. It's explained. So we can kind of go step by step, actually, through each of these, but we're not going to do that through each of these. But just some general things. For example, people feel like they're out of the body. Some people point out, well, there is this psychological phenomena called depersonalization, where you kind of feel detached from your physical body. I could tell you, as someone who struggles with anxiety issues, I have had an issue with depersonalization. It's something that I've experienced on actually multiple occasions. Something that I experienced 2 weeks ago, just because it's a thing that happens with anxiety issues. And it's an awful feeling, and it's really weird, and you feel disconnected from yourself. And, if you've experienced it, it's not fun. But I can tell you that when I read near-death experiences, what they talk about is absolutely 100% different than anything that I've experienced with a depersonalization. The one is depersonalization feels like not good. It's a scary feeling. You feel like you don't feel yourself. It's weird. Very different from the kind of peaceful experiences that we see. We also do, though, have terrifying near-death experiences, and we're going to talk about that too, because that's often neglected in these studies. Or at least in the popular literature on these ideas. They're definitely not all pleasant. So that does not seem to work. Also, the experience that's described, and here is really going to be a key difference between this and all of the supposed parallels that you're going to find in natural phenomena, is when you feel like depersonalization, it kind of feels like you're in a dream. Things feel less real than they do normally. This is the thing that's so odd about the near-death experience, which does differentiate it from a lot of these other experiences, is that everyone explains it as something that is far more real. It feels far more real than natural reality. So anything that is some kind of experience where your brain is not quite functioning as it should, you don't feel right, where you feel kind of foggy and you see weird things, or you whatever, any experience like that is fundamentally different in how it is seen as the near-death experience. It's got to be something beyond that. Also, in a depersonalization, you don't go up in the air and literally see your body. Like, it's not the same thing. Okay. And, you see this with, things like this kind of tunnel vision thing that pilots can get. Say, oh, there's a tunnel. So if someone can see a tunnel, you see a tunnel of light. It's the same thing. This kind of tunnel vision is always coming from the back, which is not the case with these experiences. They can take all different forms. The tunnel, as I said, is not actually even that common in these experiences. It is relatively common, but it's not something that's universal in these kinds of experiences. So that doesn't really fit. There have been a bunch of studies that show you can induce things that kind of bring about some of the same things through drugs or doing things in the brain. Those who have experienced a near-death experience and have had trips on acid or whatever can tell you that they're not the same. You don't have the same kind of vivid memory of some kind of hallucination in the way that you have with near-death experiences. So, for example, with a near-death experience, those memories are vivid. Those memories are more vivid than real-life memories. And we know this because we have done studies where someone's been asked, what is your near-death experience? 20 years later, that person is asked to recount that experience, and all of the details are the same, basically. So these aren't memories that change over time, which was part of an explanation. If people have this experience and they kind of add to it, they kind of imagine things, and as they look back on it, their mind adds things, because we know our memories are weird, and we do make things up, and memories are weird things. So that can happen, but that's not what's going on here, because there's a consistency in terms of time in what we remember right after the experience and 20 years later. There seems to be a lot of clarity to what's going on. So the first point is just in terms of like the question of, well, are they real? Is, well, it certainly doesn't seem like the other explanations fit. They don't fit. So whatever's going on, it can't just be that. There's got to be something beyond that. But maybe it's a different biological phenomenon. Maybe it's something different in the brain we just don't get yet. Maybe that's what's going on. Okay, fair enough. Maybe that's the case, and studies will find that. But then the question is there, though, evidence that this simply doesn't fit with what we know about the brain and the abilities of the brain at all? And here, there seem to be some pretty strong evidences that that don't seem to fit with what we know about the brain. So let's talk about what some of those things are. Now, let me first say this. The automatic response is always going to be the same from the materialist, which is these are anecdotal experiences. Anecdotal experiences cannot be verified or relied upon to make scientific conclusions. To that I say, that's true. And certainly we don't do theology by anecdotes. We shouldn't. But what we do have with near-death experiences, something far beyond anecdotes, is that we do have a number of published studies. We have published studies that do in-person interviews, with the person who had the experience, those who are around them, the doctors that have been involved. We have surveys that have been done online as well as in person. So there are a number of data points, in other words, in these studies. This is not a singular anecdotal experience. This is not 20 anecdotal experiences. This is hundreds and sometimes thousands of experiences that are being drawn on to make conclusions, that are asking some very specific questions and trying to find out what happened here. So what we have is far beyond mere anecdotes from one or two people. Because, of course, you can have people that have all sorts of insane stories. We hear it all the time. And, they may have it corroborated by someone else too. But, so you can't just have one data point there. and say, well, this person's reliable, so everything they say must be true. No, you have to have multiple individuals and multiple witnesses, and you have to look at these things over time. And since 1975, with the publication of that initial book, it's been almost 50 years, and there have been a lot of studies, and a lot of them published in medical journals. I was shocked at how many studies there actually are. I kind of went into this subject with more skepticism than I came out of it thinking, wow, like there really is a lot more that's been done in this area than I had realized. More than just these weird, like, new agey books trying to push reincarnation or something. We have plenty of that too, but there are things in medical journals. There are studies, that can be criticized and critiqued and evaluated for what they are. Okay. So then, in light of that, what are some of the points that seem to demonstrate that something is going on beyond the brain? And there are a number of these we can peg out. Here is the most obvious. And this is the best piece of evidence we have. There are more than this, though, but this is one of the best pieces of evidence we have. One is simply this, that we have a number of times where an individual is out of their body and they experience things in the room around them. They watch what the doctors are doing. They watch the surgery. They see their family and loved ones. They see how they're mourning, the things they're saying, how they respond. They are seeing things that are going on, say, in other rooms in the hospital. There are actually 2 different instances of people seeing, like, shoes in other buildings that they would not have been able to see, even if their eyes were open and looking at the window, that are later discovered to have actually been where they said they were. So we have a number of these experiences where they describe all sorts of things that are completely outside of their body in different areas that simply cannot have been grasped by means of the brain. Why not? Well, there are a couple of reasons we think that they can't have been grasped by the brain. One is sometimes it's like in a different room and they're just not there, so they would not have been able to see or hear what's going on. A second is their eyes are often closed. They have things over their ears. They often, wouldn't be able to hear what's actually happening, even if their senses were active. So it seems to be impossible. If your eyes are closed, how can you describe the look? We have instances of people describing, like, the ties that the doctors were wearing and the patterns on those ties. We have the kinds of little tiny details that would honestly be hard for someone to even remember in a regular state of consciousness, that they are able to remember. They remember, like, the ways the doctors move their hands. I mean, things that they couldn't see. Like, they could not see what was going on. They hear things from other rooms, and they're verified later. So these kind of things happen. And it's not just one experience. It's not just 2 experiences. It's not just that we're taking the words of that individual who had the experience and not verifying from anyone that was there, right? Because you can have an experience and say, oh yeah, I died this one time and floated to this other room and saw that this doctor had a pink polka dotted tie, and then asked him about it afterwards, and he said he did. Well, I mean, anybody can say whatever they want. Is that true? I don't know. You have to go interview the doctor and say, is this true? And verify with other sources. Those things have been done. Like, those things have been done. It's not just we're taking one person's word for anything. We are going and saying, well, is this the case? Have doctors seen this? And time again, these things have been verified. As I said, there have been times when an item, like a shoe, has been identified at another building where they couldn't be, and someone after the fact goes and actually finds that item where they said it was. And, you could try to find explanations for this thing. Maybe they put the shoe there, which, okay, I guess. Beforehand, they knew they were going to have a near-death experience and went to the other building and put a shoe somewhere randomly so that they could trick people. It just doesn't really make sense, okay? It doesn't really make sense. So we have those kind of things. And if that's true, that kind of tells you everything right there. There's got to be something else going on. Now, if you are a materialist in that you deny that there is any possibility of any other way of explaining these things, you're going to just find a way to explain it. Like, you're going to have to say, well, I don't know. It's anecdotal, or it could have been, maybe they heard someone talking about it. about what these people were saying. Maybe it's just a lucky guess. Maybe, there are different ways, and people do explain things in these ways, but none of these explanations really fit. They don't fit the data. They don't fit the evidence. For example, there was one of the arguments was, okay, so these things often happen in cardiac events. They tend to be most often associated with cardiac events. So people, though, may be able to guess what's happening with the surgery because they watch TV, they watch hospital shows, they kind of have seen the instruments in the room. They generally know maybe what's going on. So maybe they've had a dream about what happened, or they've created these false memories, and they're able to, pretty well say what happened, and they're able to. It's pretty accurate. Well, this was actually tested. So there was a study where there was a group of individuals who had a cardiac event, who had NDEs, and another group of individuals who had a cardiac event who didn't have NDEs. And both of those groups separately were asked, what do you think happened in the medical room? What do you think happened? And so as those two groups explained things, they found that, and there were just over, I think, about 23-ish participants on each side. And with NDEs, everyone was right. Like, they explained what happened. They explained the instruments. They explained exactly what the doctor said and did. And the doctors verified, yeah, that's exactly what happened. With the other group, 20 of the 23 were completely wrong about what had happened. And we guessed that what they were doing was they were looking at the instruments and kind of making guesses as to maybe what they were used for. They were judging it based on television shows. And the other three that did get certain elements right were extremely vague, far more vague in their explanations of what had happened than those who had the NDEs. So we've done studies to show that what happens in the NDE it's far more accurate than just a random guess. So if you were going to have like a dream about what happened, whatever your mind comes up with, that doesn't seem to fit. That doesn't seem to be what's going on. All right. So that's, that's probably the number one kind of detail that simply does not fit within a materialistic explanation. It's not really possible to explain. So you have to go to, well, everyone's lying, which you could say that, or it's just a bunch of lucky guesses or whatever. You could find a materialistic explanation. It doesn't really fit what's going on. So that's one thing that doesn't make sense. Second, we have a number of instances of individuals who are blind and who are deaf, and they are able to hear and see. Now, this differentiates these experiences from something like a dream. We have, dreams from blind and deaf, and say that they don't usually have those senses because they don't know what those senses are. There's people that are born without the sense of hearing or sight. They don't experience those things in a dream. And then they do experience these things through the near-death experience. So it's something very different than what would normally happen. And they're actually able to sometimes explain, say a blind person is able to explain the look of certain things when they didn't even have a concept of sight prior to that, or a way to even use words to explain what sight was. And when they hear other people talking about sight, you don't have the thing to connect it with. And we have instances where individuals who are blind have been able to describe in detail the looks of their friends' faces, people who they know, families' faces, who they've never seen before and never been able to describe before. So it seems to be something far beyond ordinary senses that we have the deaf and the blind able to hear and see in these experiences. Okay, so that's the second thing that certainly makes it seem like the materialistic explanations don't fit. So that's two. Then third, we have the fact that people are under general anesthesia when they are able to lucidly explain what was being said and done by the doctors. This is not something that can normally happen. These people are anesthetized purposefully so that they don't understand what is actually going on in these circumstances. But the weird thing about it is it's not just that these individuals remember little bits and pieces of things as someone who's kind of out of it and kind of awake and kind of not. No, but instead they actually vividly remember things in a way that they would not be able to vividly remember things if they were under anesthesia, even if they were like slightly out of it. So that leads to the fourth problem, which is this sense of heightened awareness. And when you have things like oxygen deprivation, which is often claimed to be a cause of this, you don't get a heightened sense of awareness. You get a lessened sense of awareness. When you're in a dream, you don't have a heightened sense of awareness. You may have some pretty realistic dreams at some points, but you don't have this hyper awareness of what's happening. So that doesn't really seem to fit anything that we know biologically either about those circumstances. Now here's the most difficult thing for the materialist to explain is we have times where people have EEGs, like we're watching what's going on in their brain, and they have no brain activity, and yet they have memories of what's happened. You know, when you have no brain activity and you're able to explain certain things that were happening at the time and what you were thinking about, what you were doing, what the people around you were doing, how do you explain that? Like, how do you explain that when there is literally no brain activity? But we have numerous instances of this. So that what? Is that 5? Is that what I did? I'm trying to remember where I'm counting these. If that's 5, I'm sorry, but whatever. You get the point. If my numbers are off, sorry about that. So 6th, then, we have something that's very interesting is the people that are encountered. Because as I mentioned, there often are encounters with, beings. Sometimes these are just beings of light who are often interpreted as angels. Sometimes these are, encounters with those who are dead. And in these experiences, which differentiates it from like a trip, if you're on drugs, or a dream, is almost every time these experiences are described. And by the way, we have to assume that some people make up the experiences. Like, nobody's assuming that, every experience that's ever reported is real. Like, of course not. People make up stuff all the time. So we're, of course, granting that not all of these are real, or that some people may have had a weird dream and have been confused. So just say that there are some genuine phenomena is not to say that all of the phenomena that occur are genuinely this. People miscategorize things, mischaracterize things, or just make stuff up, because people love to make stuff up. We know this for a fact. There was that one published book of a kid who visited heaven, which was then later admitted to have been just totally made up. And I wouldn't be surprised if we get more and more of those, especially when there's like profit motive and all sorts of other things as well. So I actually think the best NDE studies, and there are some that do this, are ones that specifically ignore those who are doing things for profit motives, or could have profit motives, in other words, so that they're not interviewing people who have written books or are planning on writing books and publishing or speaking around the world on these topics, because that does kind of muddy the waters a bit. In fact, a lot of these individuals that are interviewed, they often don't speak unless they're asked to even talk about these experiences, because we find that a lot of people are afraid to share the experience because they just think no one will believe them, and they think that everyone will think it's just kind of crazy, because it sounds crazy. They do sound a little crazy. We're talking about those who have experiences of those who have passed on. When we've looked at these, hardly any of the experiences that we have recorded include people that are still alive. Like, they are people that are dead. And this differentiates this from, again, what we know in terms of what you see in a dream or some kind of, drug-induced vision or a psychotic episode where you're seeing people that are alive. And even beyond that, there are instances where you see people who are dead, and then an individual, and Habermas gets into some of the specifics in this particular volume of these instances, but there are instances where someone had died and the person seeing them doesn't know that that person has died, and sees them with a bunch of dead people and are told they're dead. And then after the experience is over, mentions the people they saw and says, I saw this person. And then, the family or whoever says, well, that person's still alive. So that doesn't make any sense. And then they actually find out later that they had just died, or had died, a little while before this, and they had not known. So there are things that they shouldn't know that are in these kinds of experiences that it is very difficult to explain in other ways. All right. So that's 6. So the seventh point that I think is important, but it doesn't necessarily by itself prove that these are supernatural experiences, but it does prove that they are not purely culturally determined experiences, is that many of these elements of these NDEs simply transcend culture. They are not dependent upon one's religious beliefs. They are not dependent upon whether one has any religious beliefs whatsoever. So there have been studies that have been done in nations that are largely secular that really have no difference in terms of the experience of NDEs versus those who are not secular. In other words, it's not that this is just cultural ideas that are developed in a particular person, so that, say, if one studies a lot of NDEs, they're going to come out with an NDE experience when they have, say, a heart attack or whatever, some kind of cardiac event. So that it seems like, regardless of one's beliefs, these same general things are going to happen. Now, what we do see, and this is what we're going to explore when we look at the question of how Christians look at this in terms of our theology and how this fits within our worldview and what to do with these experiences, is people from different cultures will interpret things a little differently, even if the experiences are largely the same. So, for example, there are, individuals who, well, pretty much everybody will see these beings of light of some kind. Not all of the experience, but a large percentage of the experiences. And so people from different religions interpret these beings of light as being angels or yamduts or whatever, something else. So they interpret them as being these different things depending on what their own religious background is. But that's not a question of the experience itself. That's a question of how one interprets the experience. And so those are not exactly the same thing. Okay. So that's something that certainly demonstrates, I think, that this is something beyond a subjective experience like a dream would be, dependent on your own experiences. For example, people, who die express seeing angels, but they don't usually express them as having, wings or looking like cherubs, or, they're not seeing these things in the way that maybe is popularly categorized, that they may have imbibed by their culture that maybe you'd see in a dream. So the eighth thing that I want to point out then with some of these experiences is that they differ from things like dreams because they actually have endings. What you don't see is, someone in the middle of the experience, all of a sudden they just wake up and they're halfway through. That there is always a conclusion, like that they are told you must go back or something, and then they go back. Like when we can explore what some of these things are. But it doesn't seem to fit the regular pattern that we have of dreams, where you can't control when you wake up. You just wake up when you wake up. But here it seems like it's a definitive end. And then the ninth and final thing is just the nature of the fact that these individuals continue to say it felt more real than reality. Which, sure, I mean, maybe you can we'll find a way in the brain to explain why that's the case. Maybe there's some hyperactivity somewhere in the brain that we couldn't even monitor that shows that. I mean, I don't, of course, we don't know that. But at least as far as we can tell, it doesn't seem to fit with what we know of other experiences, that it feels more real than real. So when you talk to people that have had these experiences, and you say, how do you know your experience was real? They would liken it to, well, how do you know you're awake right now? Like, I knew my experience was real more than I know that I'm awake right now. Like, the difference between when you're awake and when you're dreaming. So there is some kind of subjectivity in what we know. Like, there is a subjective judgment call based on how we feel of whether we're awake or not. I can't definitively prove that you're awake right now. Can you definitively prove that you're awake right now? Of course. Like, how could you do that? You can't do a test, because if you did a test, then you'd be doing a test in your dream that would verify something that's not real because it's a dream. Like you can't really do that. So we all do trust subjective experience of our realities to some degree. We have to. That's just the nature of how you have to function in the world. So when you think about those kind of subjective experiences, it does seem to those people, at least, that it's just self-evident that these things were real. So those are the reasons, and I know I'm at an hour here so those are the reasons why I think these experiences can be verified as something real. And that then leads us to what we'll deal with in a second program on this, which is, okay, if these experiences are something that's really happening, that at least isn't a biological experience, how do we deal with these experiences biblically and theologically? Are they accurate to what Scripture teaches? Are they demonic experiences? What do we do with them? What do we do with them? Are there contradictions between the experiences? Are they all accurate? Do we take them all for granted to say that they're all real? Start doing our theology based on near-death experiences instead of Scripture? Like, how does this work? So that's what we're going to look at next time, is what do these things say in terms of a Christian approach? But what I think this does, when we look at the evidence, is that I think we see the apologetic value in this. The apologetic value of these experiences is that it demonstrates the distinction between body and soul. It demonstrates that it is possible to exist as a soul without a body, and it defeats materialism. So it is an apologetic argument against materialism. What I think gets more difficult is then using it as an apologetic argument for any particular religion, honestly, because what we have in these experiences is they do often contradict each other in terms of what religious ideas people take out of them. We have people that come out of them very convinced that Christianity is true and they've converted, but we also have people that come out of them and are like, oh, I'm going to be Hindu or whatever. Like, so the category that some have placed these in is more of general revelation than special revelation. In other words, we can see things about reality that we don't totally understand, and we can see that there are spiritual things about reality that we don't understand. But it's not generally the case that someone comes back from these experiences and says, I met Jesus, he told me he died for my sins. Those things, we do have some testimonies like that. But it's not like that's the universal testimony. It seems to be more vague. It seems to be more, I was separated from my body. I understood that there's this loving force, that God exists, that he loves. I had a life review. I realized that my actions matter and how I treat people matters. It's kind of vague stuff that we find in a lot of this. So we're going to get into how exactly to approach that in the next program, and then we'll look at what some of the Christian responses are, how they've dealt with these things, and then which responses I think are beneficial and which responses we should what things we shouldn't be doing in responding to these kind of things. So I hope you found this helpful. I know it's like a weird topic and it's beyond what I usually talk about. And it's a kind of thing that usually I would think of as too kind of ethereal and you can't really grasp it. It's, just too experiential. And so that I wouldn't necessarily usually see these as the kind of things to talk about. But when I've looked into this more and I've looked into literature, there is some objective basis to this. Like there is some kind of way to evaluate whether these kinds of experiences are probably not purely material, because the materialistic explanations simply don't work. Whatever explanation you want to give, the materialistic ones don't fit. And I think that's the conclusion that I come to here. So what explanation do we give? And that's for the next program. So thanks so much for watching and hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you want me to continue this kind of stuff. I know it's weird, but I think it is interesting and I like to do different things sometimes. So we'll see you in the next one. God bless.